Greg Thompson is a 48-year-old builder who manages construction sites in Melbourne, Australia. He's a hard worker who always tells the truth. Greg raised his daughter Emily with good values. Though he looks tough on the outside, inside he has a kind heart that's been hurt but stays loyal to those he loves. Sophie Wilson is 45 years old and is Greg's ex-wife. She works as a marketing boss in Sydney. She's well-dressed, smart, and wants to succeed in life. These things made Greg fall in love with her at first, but later caused problems. Their marriage ended when Sophie had a secret relationship with Dan. Dan Murray is 50 years old and is Sophie's boyfriend. He's also a big boss in marketing. He knows how to charm people and get what he wants. Greg never trusted him, but was still shocked when he found out about Sophie's relationship with Dan. Emily Thompson is 24 years old and is Greg and Sophie's only child. She plans parties for a living in Sydney. Emily is stuck between her parents who don't talk to each other. Deep down, she loves her dad, but her mom's influence and her parents' divorce have pushed her away from him. One evening, Greg was drinking a beer after work when his phone made a sound. He was sitting alone in his small but nice apartment near Melbourne. He looked at his phone, hoping Emily had messaged him. They hadn't talked for weeks, and he wanted to know how her wedding plans were going. But it wasn't a message from Emily. It was a picture of a wedding invitation on Emily's Instagram. Greg's heart dropped when he saw it. The invitation wasn't sent to him, but he could see all the details. The card was fancy, with gold writing and flowers on it. It said, "Emily and Lucas are getting married on October 12th at Golden Hills Estate, Sydney." October 12th. That was tomorrow. Greg felt sick. He knew the wedding was coming soon, but he thought, no, he hoped, that Emily had just forgotten to send him an invitation. Surely his daughter wouldn't leave him out of the biggest day of her life. He couldn't breathe. His own daughter hadn't invited him to her wedding. He remembered talking to her months ago when she first got engaged. He had offered to help pay for the wedding and walk her down the aisle. He wanted to help any way he could. But she always said, "Don't worry about it, Dad. We're keeping it small." That was a lie. Greg looked at the comments under the Instagram post. There were hundreds. Old friends, family, people he hadn't seen in years were all saying congratulations to Emily. Everyone knew about the wedding except him. Greg's heart was beating fast. His hand shook as he put down his phone. He remembered all the times with Emily when she was little, their family trips, reading her stories at night, teaching her to ride a bike. He had always been there for her, loving her no matter what. How could she shut him out like this? He picked up his phone and called Emily. It rang twice before going to voicemail. He tried again. Still voicemail. He was getting angry and held his phone tighter. Then a text message came in from Sophie. "Greg, don't make this harder than it needs to be. Emily made her choice. Please respect it. We don't need any problems tomorrow." Problems? Respect her choice? Greg slammed his phone on the table. He knew his ex-wife had something to do with this. And he could guess who would be walking Emily down the aisle. Dan, the man who had stolen Sophie from him, pretending to be their friend. Greg always felt something was wrong, but he never thought it would come to this. For years, Greg tried to forget about Sophie's affair with Dan and move on. But knowing Dan would take his place and walk Emily down the aisle was too much. It felt like he'd been replaced in his family, like he didn't matter anymore. Things weren't always this bad. Greg and Sophie met when they were young, just out of school and starting their careers. Greg started as a carpenter's helper before becoming a site manager. They got married young and had Emily soon after. Life was good then. But as Sophie got more successful in marketing, things changed. She wasn't happy with Greg's simple life anymore. She wanted more excitement than Greg could give her. She started working late, going on business trips, and attending parties. This created distance between them. but Greg loved her and believed in their marriage. He ignored the warning signs. Sophie coming home later and later, laughing at texts late at night, dressing up more for work. Greg wasn't jealous usually, but Dan Murray made him uncomfortable. Dan was always around Sophie, making jokes about Greg. But Greg trusted Sophie, or wanted to. One evening, Greg found messages between Sophie and Dan. He didn't like checking her phone, but something felt wrong for months, and he needed answers. The messages showed they were more than friends. His heart broke when he realized his wife was seeing someone else. When Greg confronted Sophie, she didn't deny it. Instead, she looked at him like she felt sorry for him and said, "Greg, we haven't been happy for years. I need more. Dan understands me in ways you never could." Those words hurt deeply. The divorce was ugly, and Greg was crushed. Emily, who was still a teenager, had trouble dealing with it. She split her time between Greg's small apartment and Sophie's fancy house. Over time, Sophie had more influence over Emily, especially after she started dating Dan. Greg thought Sophie tried to turn Emily against him, slowly breaking their father-daughter bond. But despite everything, Greg hoped Emily would always need him, that deep down, she would always be his little girl. The next morning, Greg woke up feeling heavy. He'd spent all night thinking about Emily's life, the day she was born, holding her tiny body, and how she gave him strength after the divorce. He felt sad and angry, but also determined. Greg decided he wouldn't stay home feeling sorry for himself while Dan took his place at the wedding. He put on his best suit, a dark blue one he'd worn to Emily's high school graduation. It was old but looked good. He fixed his thinning hair and looked in the mirror. He wasn't the same man anymore. Time had aged him inside and out, but he still had fight left in him. This was his daughter's special day, and he would be there whether they liked it or not. Greg grabbed his car keys and drove to Golden Hills Estate, the beautiful vineyard near Sydney, where the wedding was happening. The drive was long, and he thought about what to say or do when he got there. He just knew Emily needed to see him, to know he hadn't given up on her, no matter what Sophie or Dan said. When he got to the estate, Greg felt amazed but also bitter. The place was beautiful. Green hills, rows of grapevines as far as you could see, and a pretty white church in the middle. It was the kind of fancy place Sophie would choose. Very different from the simple wedding Greg had imagined for Emily when she was younger. Greg parked far from the main entrance and took a deep breath. He could hear music playing, people talking, and laughter in the wind. He wasn't invited, but that didn't matter anymore. Greg stood where he could see the ceremony, but people couldn't see him. His heart was racing as he looked for Emily. He saw Sophie first, wearing an expensive dress, laughing with friends like nothing was wrong. Then he saw Dan next to her, his hand on Sophie's back as they talked to guests. Greg's fist tightened when he saw him. This was the man who had taken everything: his wife, his family, and now his daughter. Then he saw her. Emily, his beautiful daughter, glowing in her wedding dress. She was talking to her bridesmaids, looking so happy. Greg could hardly breathe. He hadn't seen her in months and realized how much he'd missed. But his heart broke when Dan walked up to her and put his hand on her shoulder. Emily smiled at him, a smile that should have been for Greg. Then the music changed, showing the ceremony was starting, and Emily took Dan's arm. He was going to walk her down the aisle. No, Greg wouldn't let this happen without a fight. He stepped forward, his mind racing. The guests were sitting down, about to start, but Greg couldn't let this moment pass. He walked quickly toward the ceremony before he could stop himself. People started noticing Greg. The talking stopped, and everything went quiet. He could feel everyone looking at him, but he didn't care. All that mattered was Emily, his daughter, who was about to walk down the aisle with the man who had ruined his family. Sophie saw him first. Her eyes got big, and she whispered something to Dan, who turned around. Dan's smug smile disappeared when he saw Greg coming. Greg's presence changed everything, like a storm cloud on a sunny day. "Greg!" Sophie stepped forward, speaking quietly but firmly, like she was warning him. But Greg was done being warned, silenced, and pushed aside. He was done being forgotten in his own family's story. Emily, who had been focused on the ceremony, looked up and saw her father. Her face went white, and their eyes met. In that moment, Greg saw everything he needed to: guilt, fear, and maybe some regret. "Dad?" Emily's voice was quiet, barely heard over the wind in the vines. She stood still, her arms still linked with Dan's, clearly shocked to see him. Greg's heart was pounding, his feelings almost out of control. But this wasn't about anger or getting back at them anymore. It was about being heard, about making sure his daughter knew what this meant to him. "Emily," Greg said, loud enough for everyone to hear, but gentle enough to show his pain. "I love you. I've always loved you, and I thought I would be the one walking you down the aisle today." The guests moved uncomfortably, not sure what to do about this emotional moment. Sophie looked angry, ready to stop it, but Greg kept going. "I don't know what happened between us, why you felt you couldn't have me here, but I'm your father, and I've been there your whole life. I deserve to be part of this day." Emily started crying, her lips shaking as she looked between her father and Dan. Dan's grip on Emily's arm loosened. For a moment, Greg worried she might go through with it, that she might turn away from him completely. But then, something changed in her face. The fear and confusion went away, replaced by deep sorry. She stepped away from Dan, taking her arm away from his. The guests gasped softly, not sure what was happening. "Dad?" Emily's voice broke as she stepped toward him. I didn't invite you because I didn't want you to be upset. I thought it would be easier, less complicated if..." Greg shook his head, his eyes full of tears. "Easier? For who? For you or for them?" Emily's face crumbled and tears ran down her cheeks. "I'm sorry, Dad. I'm so sorry." She was shaking, holding her wedding dress like it would keep her steady. "I thought you didn't want to be in my life anymore, that you moved on after the divorce, after everything." "How could you think that?" Greg's voice got softer as he stepped closer. "You're my daughter. You've always been my everything." After a short silence, Emily ran into his arms, crying against his chest. Greg held her tight, his own tears falling as all the feelings from the past few years came out. For a moment, time seemed to stop. The guests sat in shocked silence, watching father and daughter come back together. Sophie stood nearby, arms crossed, lips tight. Dan stood awkwardly to the side, uncomfortable but quiet. The tension between him and Greg was strong, but Greg wasn't here for him. He was here for Emily. "I'm sorry I didn't invite you, Dad," Emily whispered through her tears. "I thought, Mom said it would be better this way, that it would be easier if Dan..." Greg pulled back a little, putting his hands on her shoulders and looking in her eyes. "I know what your mother told you, Emily, but that doesn't matter now. I'm here, and I always will be." Emily nodded, wiping her tears. She looked back at the altar where Lucas, her soon-to-be husband, stood watching everything happen. He looked concerned but understanding. He wasn't upset, just surprised. Emily smiled at him, feeling happier than she had all day. Taking a deep breath, Emily turned back to her father. "Will you still walk me down the aisle, Dad?" Greg felt proud and relieved. "Of course I will." The mood changed. There was no more tension or uncertainty. The guests relaxed, and the awkward whispers stopped as Emily took her father's arm. The music started again, soft and peaceful, and the sun seemed brighter as they walked down the aisle. As Greg walked with Emily, he felt things coming full circle. All the pain from the past few years started to fade with each step. It wasn't perfect, and it wasn't the wedding day he had imagined for his daughter, but it was real. Right then, nothing mattered except the bond between father and daughter. When they reached the altar, Greg handed Emily to Lucas, giving him a firm nod and pat on the back. "Take care of her," he said, his voice emotional. Lucas nodded seriously, understanding what Greg meant. Greg sat down with the other guests, who now looked at him with respect. He had fought for his place in his daughter's life, and he had won. He watched proudly as Emily and Lucas said their vows, his heart full. After the ceremony, everyone celebrated under a big white tent near the vineyard. People mixed and laughed as the newlyweds celebrated their marriage. Greg stood at the edge of the crowd, drinking and watching Emily from far away. She looked radiant, happier than he'd seen her in years. Sophie came up to him, looking frustrated. "You just couldn't let it go, could you?" she said quietly, glaring at him with her arms crossed. Greg turned to face her, calm but firm. "This isn't about you, Sophie. It's about Emily. She needed her father today, and I wasn't going to let her down." Sophie laughed and rolled her eyes. "She was fine without you." Greg shook his head, looking straight at her. "No, she wasn't. And deep down, you know that." There was a short silence as Sophie's look weakened. She had always been proud, always wanted control, but today she had lost. And Greg wouldn't let her take that away from him. Sophie said nothing more, just turned and walked away, her pride hurt. Greg watched her go but felt no bitterness. He had won the only battle that mattered. Later that evening, as the sun was setting and the party was ending, Emily found her father standing by the dance floor. She smiled, walking over with her new husband. "Dad," Emily said softly, her eyes full of thanks. "Thank you for being here, for everything." Greg smiled, hugging her. "I wouldn't have missed it for anything." As they stood together, father and daughter reunited, Greg knew things wouldn't be perfect going forward. There were still hurts to heal, still things to talk about. But for the first time in years, he felt hope. Hope that he and Emily could rebuild their relationship. Hope that their bond would grow stronger with time. The night ended with Greg watching Emily and Lucas dance their first dance as husband and wife. He sat quietly at his table, his heart full, feeling lighter than he had in a long time. He had lost so much over the years, but today he had gotten back something more valuable, his place in his daughter's life. As the music played, Greg thought about everything that had brought him here. Life could surprise you, test how strong you are. But in the end, love, real, unconditional love, always found a way to shine through. If this story touched your heart, or if you understand how Greg felt, please leave a comment below. Share your thoughts, your experiences, or just some kind words. And don't forget to like and share this story if it meant something to you. We'd love to hear what you think. Let's keep talking about it.